If you had to define the concept of comedy with the career of a single person, Dick Van Dyke would be that person. But the actor has faced struggles. From relationship woes to addiction battles, here are some tragic details about the legend. Is there anyone on the planet who's more fun and infectiously happy than Dick Van Dyke? Though a quick peek at his IMDb page reveals that his most long-running role is, oddly enough, the crime-solving Dr. Mark Sloan in the comparatively serious Diagnosis Murder. The highlights of his excessive filmography almost invariably feature him in roles in which his assured, slightly goofy happiness and considerable knack for physical comedy are at the forefront. Due to his reputation as an affable sort of comedic genius, it's very easy to assume that Van Dyke is a huge extrovert who just can't help but flash that famous grin every time he sees a fellow human being. This could not be further from the truth. In a 2016 interview for Oprah's Where Are They Now?, Van Dyke revealed that he has struggled with extreme shyness to the point that he found it difficult to approach others.
I was very shy. With strangers, I just couldn't talk to people.
He soon found a way to treat this debilitating bashfulness, though the cure would eventually prove far worse than the ailment. Alcohol helped Van Dyke to loosen up, but as we'll soon see, it created another problem altogether. During a 2016 appearance in Oprah Where Are They Now?, Dick Van Dyke revealed that his attempts to minimize his shyness with alcohol ultimately led to a lengthy struggle with addiction that took him years to conquer. In fact, he confirmed to the Bullseye with Jesse Thorne podcast that he didn't quit drinking until middle age, and opened up about his situation before that happened. "I drank at home, but instead of having a martini, I would have 3 or 4 martinis. I had no idea that I had addiction in my personality." Van Dyke eventually managed to stop drinking, and his decision to open up about his personal substance use issues has done plenty of good. In fact, he said that many people have found strength from his confession, and he still gets letters from fans telling him that his own openness helped them come to grips with their drinking problems. Dick Van Dyke struggled with alcohol addiction for a long time, and in a 2013 interview with The Telegraph, he said that it took a toll on his mental health. He reportedly became very depressed and even considered self-harm to the point that he was, quote, suicidal. As strange as it is to imagine Van Dyke like this, the National Institute of Mental Health reminds us that depression is a common mental health issue that can affect all kinds of people. Van Dyke was ultimately able to resolve his alcohol-induced bad situation when he grew weary of alcohol itself. He eventually even developed a physical distaste for drinking, which helped him to quit for good. However, he also noted it wasn't a solo effort, and that at various points of his life, he sought help from sources like rehab and Alcoholics Anonymous. In a 2010 interview with Craig Ferguson, Dick Van Dyke shared a story of a real-life close call that would seem too much to believe if it came from anyone else. That he was once stranded at sea and got saved by a group of porpoises. It all started, he said, when he fell asleep atop a surfboard and jolted awake to discover that he was in great peril after the tide had carried him out in the sea. With no land in sight, he started to paddle in, then saw fins all around him and realized that porpoises were pushing his surfboard all the way to land. Is this story an exaggeration, or was it truly just Dick Van Dyke's incredible luck? We may never know. There are many sitcoms that are named after their star, but The Dick Van Dyke Show is particularly clear about its main attraction. By Van Dyke's own admission, though, The Dick Van Dyke Show wasn't originally intended to be The Dick Van Dyke Show. Show creator Carl Reiner, who appears in the finished product as Van Dyke's TV star boss, Alan Brady, originally intended to be the main star, but his take on the character didn't end up working at all. It was only after Reiner realized his show wasn't working that he offered the part to Van Dyke. After these hurdles had been cleared, Van Dyke basically ditched everything to take a shot at the show. As he explained on Bullseye with Jesse Thorne, he even threw his own pilot script away so he could work with Reiner after reading the first scripts for the series. Just a few years after Van Dyke opened up about being saved by porpoises, he had another far less poetic brush with death. In August 2013, the entertainment legend's official Twitter account posted an image of an utterly destroyed Jaguar sports car, accompanied with the text, "Used Jag for sale, real cheap." This was not just a strange little social media joke. According to The Guardian, the then 87-year-old Van Dyke had indeed been driving on Route 101 in California when suddenly his sports car caught fire. The actor managed to pull over safely, but had to be rescued from the smoking vehicle by passers-by. Thankfully, Van Dyke emerged from the burning vehicle with no injuries. As his tweet about the situation attests, his comedic timing was also as impeccable as ever. Even at an age in which most people would be content to lounge in a rocking chair and watch daytime soaps, Dick Van Dyke has managed to stay active. According to the Chicago Tribune, he was still happily hitting the gym on a daily basis at 89, and he's written a book that discusses advanced age fitness. However, he's very familiar with unhealthy habits, such as cigarettes. The comedian smoked for quite a long time, and as the Washington Post notes, it was far from a casual vice. In fact, he smoked up to 3 packs a day and fully admits that he was addicted to nicotine. Van Dyke has called cigarettes, quote, the worst of all addictions. It was so difficult for him to quit smoking that he ultimately had to be literally scared away from the habit. It wasn't until a doctor finally showed him an x-ray of his own lungs and pointed out the scar tissue on them that he finally gave up for good. Van Dyke's smoking days are long gone, but it may not be entirely coincidental that his lungs have given him trouble in his later days. Reportedly, he's had to deal with pneumonia and one of his lungs has even collapsed. Sometimes people author their own tragedies, and that was the case when Dick Van Dyke had an affair that ended his marriage with Margie Willett. In 1972, Van Dyke and Willett were both treated for addiction, he to alcohol, she to prescription drugs. Van Dyke later told The Guardian that he feels this was a sign of even deeper issues, since he led the high life of a famous star and she had little interest in such matters. Unfortunately, he decided to deal with this by starting an affair with Michelle Triola, who worked for his agent and was a former actress herself. In his memoirs, Van Dyke said he was, quote, writhing in guilt over the affair and eventually decided he had to be honest about it. Said honesty was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage, and Willett and Van Dyke decided to live apart and eventually divorced in 1984. Still, while their relationship ultimately ended because of his infidelity, Van Dyke says that Willett's illness and death in 2008 took a heavy toll on him. He later said that when Willett passed away, he felt he'd lost a part of himself. A longtime partner's death is always a tragedy, and Van Dyke's long life has meant that he unfortunately had to deal with the loss of his love of many years, Michelle Triola, when she died in 2009 at the age of 76. As The Guardian notes, Triola and Van Dyke were together for a long time, though Triola's better-known relationship is arguably her 6-year one with the actor Lee Marvin. Triola never married either Marvin or Van Dyke, though she did take Marvin's name for a time. This ended up making legal history after they separated in 1970 and Marvin stopped his agreed payments to her. The ensuing lengthy legal battle established the concept of palimony, divorce payments in cases of unmarried couples who live together but break up. Triola's death was hard for Van Dyke for more than just the obvious reasons. He just lost his ex-wife to cancer in 2008, and though he had an idea of what the end result of Triola's own lung cancer diagnosis would be, he was determined to remain confident that there was a chance she'd survive, at least on the outside. As he explained to The Guardian, when she asked if she was going to die, I pretended I didn't know. The hardest acting I have ever done. Imagine having a strange neurological disorder that causes you no end of discomfort and that no one seems to be able to properly diagnose. Now, imagine having to live with it for a whopping 7 years and you have an idea of what Dick Van Dyke went through. According to Entertainment Tonight, the actor's condition consisted of a strange heartbeat-like sound inside his head, and none of the numerous treatments and tests he'd gone through managed to solve the problem. Over the years, it got so bad that it severely affected his ability to function due to the sheer fatigue it caused. In 2013, Van Dyke revealed the situation when he took to Twitter to crowdsource solutions to his mystery ailment. This openness may have led to a breakthrough because a few weeks after his initial tweet, his Twitter account posted that the case of his mysterious throbbing head was finally solved, and that the root cause of the problem was actually his famous smile. Van Dyke later tweeted that his titanium dental implants were actually what caused the pounding sensation. Dick Van Dyke has played many great roles, but as The Guardian tells us, one particular thing has haunted him for decades. His performance as Bert, the multi-talented chimney sweep in Mary Poppins, is a masterclass of song, dance, and physical comedy. Unfortunately, the character is also saddled with what Van Dyke himself has called, quote, the most atrocious Cockney accent in the history of filmmaking.
Number 17 Cherry Tree Line, you say? All right, come on with me.
To be fair, Van Dyke didn't mangle the dialect on purpose. In fact, when making the film, he was under the impression that he was doing a pretty decent job with the character's accent, because no one told him otherwise. After the film came out, however, people have more than made up for this lack of feedback over the years. Though Van Dyke doesn't come across as a particularly negative man, years of reflecting on this criticism make it seem that the whole Cockney accent thing has nevertheless gotten under his skin. After all, in 2017, he actually used his BAFTA award speech to formally apologize for his linguistic crimes against Cockney. We still love you, Bert. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please contact the Crisis Text Line by texting HOME to 741-741. Call the National Alliance on Mental Illness helpline at 1-800-950-NAMI 6264 or visit the National Institute of Mental Health website.